New Orleans, Louisiana, the summer of 1942. A hot, wet night in a city built on swamp. Inside a sprawling plant on St. Charles Avenue, the lights are still burning long after midnight. The air smells of sawdust, marine glue, and cigarette smoke. Rows of squat wooden boats sit in various stages of construction, their blunt bows pointed toward the doors like animals waiting to be let out. A man in his middle 50s walks the floor. He is heavy-set, red-faced, loud, and almost never sober by the end of a working day. He curses at the machinery. He curses at the government. He curses most of all at the United States Navy. His name is Andrew Jackson Higgins, and he has spent the better part of a decade being told that the boat he is building does not matter. He is wrong about very few things, and he is right about this. The boat matters more than almost anything else being built in America that year. Within 24 months, thousands of these ugly plywood craft will carry the first waves of soldiers onto the beaches of Normandy. Thousands more will push through the surf toward Japanese-held islands across the Pacific. The men who ride them will remember the flat clang of the ramp dropping, the sudden grey light, and the water rushing in around their boots. Many will die in the first few seconds. Many more will live, walk up the sand, and win the war that those seconds began. And here is the strange part. The man who built these boats was not a Navy officer. He was not a famous engineer. He held no significant government position. He was a lumber dealer from Nebraska who came to Louisiana to sell wood, ended up building boats for oil drillers and trappers in the bayous, and then spent years in a bitter, profane public war against the very Navy that would one day depend on him completely. He was an outsider who fought the establishment harder than he ever fought the enemy. There is a phrase that has followed Andrew Higgins for decades. The story goes that Adolf Hitler himself spoke of Higgins with something close to fear, that the German dictator called him the new Noah, the man who built the boats that would carry an army across the water and land it wherever it pleased. It is a haunting image, the tyrant of Europe studying maps, naming a New Orleans boat builder as a kind of biblical threat. We need to be honest with you right at the start, because this channel is about getting the history right, not just telling a good story. That quote, the new Noah line attributed to Hitler, is one that appears again and again in articles and speeches and museum gift shop books. And yet, when you go looking for the original source, for the document, the transcript, the reliable first-hand account, it becomes very hard to pin down. It may be true. It may be an embellishment that grew in the retelling. What we can say with confidence is that it is not firmly documented in the way a careful historian would want. So we will not build this story on a quote we cannot prove. We do not need to, because there is another quote about Andrew Higgins, and this one is real, and this one is arguably even more astonishing. It comes from the man who commanded the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, the general who ordered the landings at Normandy, and who later became President of the United States. In an interview given in 1964 to the historian Stephen Ambrose, Eisenhower said something that stops you cold when you first read it. He said that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. Not a man who helped, not a man who contributed, the man who won it. Eisenhower went further. He explained why. He said that if Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, the whole strategy of the war would have had to be different. The Allies would have been forced to attack the enemy where the enemy was strongest, at the fortified ports, and the entire nature of the fighting would have changed. Because of Higgins, the Allies could land anywhere, and landing anywhere changed everything. So here is the question this whole story turns on. How does a hard-drinking, foul-mouthed lumberman from Nebraska, working out of New Orleans, with no Navy background and no political power, end up building the boats that a five-star general credits with winning the Second World War? And why did the United States Navy, the institution that should have wanted these boats most of all, spend years trying to shut him out? The answer is not that Higgins was a lucky amateur who stumbled onto something, and it is not that the Navy was simply staffed by fools. The truth is more interesting than either of those easy explanations. The answer has to do with a boat designed for a job that had nothing to do with war. It has to do with a bureaucracy that trusted its own experts more than it trusted an outsider. And it has to do with a fundamental question about how you get an army from the sea onto the land. A question that most of the world had answered wrong, and that one stubborn man in Louisiana had answered right, years before anyone knew there would be a war to answer it for. To understand why the boat mattered, you have to understand the problem it solved. And to understand the problem, you have to go back long before the war, to the shallow brown water of the Louisiana wetlands. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born in Columbus, Nebraska, in 1886. He was the youngest of several children, and his father died when Andrew was still a boy. He was, by every account, a difficult and energetic child who grew into a difficult and energetic man. He had a temper that became legendary. He worked with a ferocity that exhausted the people around him, and from an early age he was fascinated by boats, which is a strange obsession for a boy growing up on the dry plains of Nebraska. As a teenager, he is said to have built a small boat in the basement of the family home, and then discovered it was too big to get out the door, a story that, whether polished or not, fits the man perfectly. He would spend his whole life building things bigger than the doors other people wanted to keep him behind. He went into the lumber business, and lumber is what eventually brought him south. He arrived in New Orleans in the early 1910s and built himself up in the timber trade, importing tropical hardwoods and dealing in cypress and pine. He was good at it, and he was ambitious, and by the 1920s he had prospered, failed, and clawed his way back more than once. He knew what it was to run a business to the edge of ruin, and he never lost the gambler's willingness to bet everything on his own judgment. The lumber trade took him into the coastal waters and the swamps, and there he ran straight into a problem that would define his life. The boats available at the time were no good for the water he needed to work in. He was, by this point, already the man his employees would come to know. He drove himself and everyone around him mercilessly. He worked long into the night and expected others to do the same. He drank, heavily and openly, and he swore with a fluency that shocked even hardened shipyard men. He had a volcanic temper and an ego to match, and he could be generous 1 hour and savage the next. But he had an almost physical intuition for how things worked in the water, a feel for hulls and loads and shallow currents that no formal engineering degree had given him, because he had none. What he had was decades of watching boats succeed and fail in the most punishing conditions in America, and an absolute refusal to accept that a problem could not be solved. The Gulf Coast of Louisiana is not like the open sea. It is a maze of marsh, bayou, and shallow inlet. The water can be only a foot or two deep, choked with mud, sandbars, submerged logs, and floating vegetation. The men who worked those waters, the oil drillers pushing into the wetlands, the fur trappers, the fishermen, needed a boat that could operate where an ordinary boat could not. They needed something that could run through shallow water without tearing out its propeller, something that could ride up onto a mudbank or a sandy shore, unload, and then pull itself back off into the water. Something rugged, cheap, and simple enough to fix in the middle of nowhere. Higgins set out to build exactly that. By the middle of the 1920s, his company had developed a shallow draft workboat that he called the Eureka, and he refined it steadily through the years that followed. The name is the old cry of discovery, and it was well chosen. The Eureka boat could do things other boats could not. Its most important feature was the shape of its hull, and in particular, the shape of its bow and the tunnel that protected its propeller. Let us talk about that hull, because it is the heart of everything that follows. Most boats are designed to cut through water. Their hulls are shaped to slice forward and to sit relatively deep, with the propeller hanging down below exposed. That is fine in deep, clean water. It is a disaster in a Louisiana bayou, where that exposed propeller will strike the bottom or foul on debris within minutes. Higgins designed his hull differently. He built in a recessed tunnel along the bottom, a kind of protective channel, so that the propeller sat up inside the hull rather than hanging below it. The water was drawn up into this tunnel to reach the propeller, which meant the spinning blades were shielded from the mud, and the logs, and the sandbars. And then there was the bow. Higgins gave his boat a distinctive spoon-shaped bow, a bow that curved up and forward in a way that let the boat ride up over obstacles and up onto solid ground, rather than digging in and stopping dead. The boat could drive itself partway up onto a beach or a bank, sit there stable while men and cargo moved across it, and then reverse itself back off into the water under its own power. It did not need a dock. It did not need deep water. It made its own landing place wherever it happened to be. Think about what that meant for the men who first bought these boats. An oil company pushing a drilling operation into the marsh no longer needed to build expensive infrastructure to reach it. A trapper could run his boat right up to the muddy edge of an island, step off, and step back on. This was a genuinely new capability for that specific, muddy, difficult world. And it made Higgins a modest living, building sturdy little boats for a rough clientele in one of the most demanding boating environments in North America. There is a persistent bit of color in the Higgins story that says some of his early boats found their way into the hands of rum runners and smugglers during Prohibition, men who also had excellent reasons to want a fast, shallow craft that could disappear into the bayous and outrun the authorities. Higgins himself was known to enjoy this reputation more than deny it. Whether or not every such tale is true, it points at something real. The Eureka boat was prized precisely by people who needed to go where normal boats could not follow. That was the whole point. Now, here is what almost no one understood at the time. The exact capability that made the Eureka boat perfect for oil drillers and trappers, and possibly the occasional smuggler, was precisely the capability that a modern army would one day need, more desperately than almost anything else. The ability to carry a load across the water and put it down on an undeveloped shore, with no dock, no harbor, no port at all, and then pull back off and do it again. In the 1930s, that was a solution to a swamp problem. Within a few years, it would be the solution to one of the hardest problems in modern warfare. But the men whose job it was to think about that warfare were not looking at a boat builder in Louisiana. They were looking at their own blueprints. And that is where the trouble began. If stories like this one matter to you, the forgotten engineering, and the stubborn people behind the history that actually changed the world, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach more people who care about getting it right. To see why Higgins ran into a wall, you have to understand the problem the military was trying to solve, and just how badly the accepted wisdom was failing to solve it. For most of military history, moving an army across water and landing it on a hostile shore was one of the most dangerous and difficult things a commander could attempt. The moment of landing was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Troops packed into boats could not fight. They could not maneuver. They were exposed, seasick, weighed down with equipment, and utterly dependent on getting ashore quickly and in the right place. An amphibious landing that went wrong could destroy an army before it ever set foot on solid ground. The conventional answer, the answer built into the thinking of most navies in the world, was that you needed a port, a real harbor with docks and cranes and deep water, where ships could tie up and unload troops and vehicles and supplies in an orderly way. Ports were how armies were supposed to arrive, and because everyone knew this, ports were exactly what a defending enemy fortified most heavily. If you wanted to invade, the logic went, you would eventually have to capture a working port, and the enemy would be waiting for you there with everything he had. This assumption ran deep, and it shaped how the other side prepared. When Germany later fortified the coast of occupied Europe, building the chain of defenses known as the Atlantic Wall, a central pillar of German thinking was that the Allies would have to seize a major port to sustain any invasion. The great fortified harbors received enormous attention. The logic seemed airtight. An army needs supply, supply needs a port. Defend the ports, and you defend against invasion. Later in the war, a costly Allied raid on the French port of Dieppe seemed, to many observers on both sides, to confirm just how murderous a direct assault on a defended harbor could be. So the central problem of amphibious warfare in this era can be stated simply. How do you land a large, mechanized, modern army with its tanks and trucks and artillery and mountains of supply without first capturing the very ports that the enemy has turned into fortresses? If you could somehow land across open, undefended beaches instead, you could strike where the enemy was weak rather than where he was strong. But to land across an open beach, you needed a very particular kind of boat. You needed a lot of them. And in the late 1930s, the United States did not really have them. Nor, to be fair, did anyone else have the full answer. The major military powers had each nibbled at the problem in their own way, and each had come up short in some important respect. The British had developed their own assault landing craft, small boats meant to put a platoon of infantry onto a beach, and they were serviceable craft that would see hard service throughout the war. But nothing in the British program approached the sheer scale and versatility that the war would eventually demand. The Japanese, as we have seen, had actually pioneered the bow ramp and used ramped landing craft effectively in China, arguably ahead of everyone else in that specific respect. Yet Japan never built landing craft in anything like the numbers or with anything like the industrial reach that the coming war across the vast Pacific would require. Germany, for its part, had given remarkably little serious thought to large-scale amphibious assault, because German strategy was built around land campaigns on the European continent, not seaborne invasions across contested oceans. When Germany briefly contemplated invading Britain across the English Channel, it found itself improvising with converted river barges, a makeshift solution that helped convince its own planners the operation was too risky to attempt. In other words, the problem of putting a modern army onto an open beach, at massive scale, again and again, was one that no nation had truly solved when the war began. The pieces existed here and there, scattered across different countries and different programs. What was missing was the combination. A boat that could beach and retract reliably, that could carry meaningful loads, that could drop a ramp to unload men and vehicles fast, and that could be mass-produced by the tens of thousands using materials and labor that a wartime economy could actually spare. Assembling all of those qualities into one craft, and then building it at overwhelming scale, was the specific thing that would tip the balance. And the man who would assemble it was not in London, or Tokyo, or Berlin. He was in New Orleans, and he had already built most of the answer before he ever thought about war. The organization responsible for solving this in the American military was, for the Navy, its own Bureau of Experts, the body responsible for the design and construction of ships and craft. These were trained naval architects and career officers. They were not stupid men, they were the recognized professionals, and they had their own ideas about what a landing boat should look like, ideas developed inside the institution by the institution's own people. The Marine Corps, meanwhile, was the branch that actually thought hardest about amphibious assault, because storming beaches was central to the Marine mission, and the Marines were increasingly desperate for a boat that actually worked. The boats produced through the official design process tended to disappoint. Test after test in the 1930s revealed craft that were hard to handle in surf, that took on water that struggled to retract from the beach once they had landed, or that simply could not take the punishment of running up onto sand and shingle again and again. The Bureau kept refining its own designs. The results kept falling short. And all the while, down in New Orleans, a man was already building, for entirely civilian reasons, a boat that did the hardest part of the job better than anything the professionals had produced. The story of how these two worlds collided is the story of a clash between an outsider and an institution, and it was not a polite one. Andrew Higgins was not a diplomatic man. He was blunt, profane, and utterly convinced that he was right, which, in this case, he largely was. When he became aware that the military was searching for a workable landing boat, he was certain that his Eureka design was the answer, and he did not understand why anyone would waste time arguing with him about it. The Marines, running their own trials, began to take serious notice of the Higgins boats, because in comparative testing, the Higgins craft repeatedly outperformed the boats produced through official channels. The boat that had been designed for oil drillers kept beating the boats that had been designed for war. You might expect that this would settle the matter quickly. It did not. The institutional preference for designs developed in-house was powerful. There was a natural resistance to handing over a critical military requirement to a brash civilian in Louisiana who had no naval pedigree and who insulted the very officers whose approval he needed. Higgins, for his part, was not the kind of man to swallow his frustration quietly. He fought back in public. He took out advertisements. He gave interviews. He fired off blistering letters and telegrams. He accused the bureaucracy of incompetence and worse, and he did it loudly, by name, in ways that made him powerful enemies inside the system, even as he built support among the Marines, and, eventually, among members of Congress, who began asking uncomfortable questions about why the boats that kept winning the tests were not the boats being ordered. This is the part of the story that is easy to misread, so it is worth being careful. This was not a simple tale of heroic genius against villainous idiots. The naval professionals had legitimate concerns about relying on a single volatile supplier, about standardization, about control. Higgins, for all his brilliance, was genuinely difficult to work with, and his combative style sometimes hurt his own cause. But underneath all the personality and politics, the physical reality kept asserting itself. When you actually put the boats in the water and asked them to do the job, the design that had come out of the Louisiana swamps kept proving superior. Reality, in the end, is a stubborn thing, and Higgins had reality on his side. The pattern repeated itself for years. The Marine Corps, through its equipment board, kept testing Higgins' boats against the craft favored by the Navy's own construction bureau, and the Higgins boats kept coming out ahead. Marine officers who had to imagine actually riding these things onto a defended beach knew what they were looking at. But the power to place the big orders did not sit with the Marines who admired the boat. It sat with the bureau that preferred its own design. And so the tests would be run, the Higgins boat would win, and the orders would still be shaped to favor the in-house craft. To Higgins, watching a demonstrably worse boat get preference over his, it was not just frustrating. It looked like corruption, or incompetence, or both, and he said so, at the top of his voice, to anyone who would listen. The fight finally broke into the open in a way the Bureau could not control. In the early 1940s, as the country lurched toward war, a United States Senate committee had been formed to investigate waste and mismanagement in the vast defense buildup. It was chaired by a then little-known senator from Missouri named Harry Truman, the same man who would later become President of the United States. The Truman Committee, as everyone called it, developed a reputation for cutting through service politics and asking blunt questions about why taxpayer money was being spent badly. The landing craft mess landed squarely in its sights. The committee looked into the long-running dispute and came down hard on the Navy Bureau's handling of it, criticizing the way the Bureau had clung to its own inferior designs and obstructed a better boat. That kind of scrutiny, from that kind of body, was very hard to ignore. Political pressure did what years of winning tests on the water had not quite managed to do on its own. It forced the door open. There was one more confrontation that became the stuff of legend inside the industry, and it concerned not the troop boat, but a larger craft designed to carry a tank. The Navy needed a landing craft that could deliver a medium tank onto a beach, and here too the Bureau had its own design, which Higgins regarded as badly flawed. The story that has come down, and that his biographer records, is that when Higgins was pressed to show he could build such a craft quickly, he threw his men at the problem around the clock and produced a working tank carrying landing craft in an astonishingly short span, a matter of a few days, when the usual process would have taken far longer. Later, in competitive testing, a Higgins tank lighter was pitted against the Bureau's own design, and the Higgins craft proved the better boat. Whether every detail of the fast build story is exactly as retold, the essential outcome is well documented. Higgins produced a superior tank lighter, and he used the contrast to hammer home his central argument. The professionals were not producing the boats the war was going to need, and he was. There was still one crucial piece missing, and it is a piece that reveals just how much the final war-winning boat owed to ideas gathered from around the world. The Eureka boat, for all its brilliance in the shallows, unloaded the way an ordinary boat does. Men and cargo had to go over the sides or over the bow. For a civilian workboat, that was fine. For a boat meant to land soldiers into the teeth of enemy fire, it was a deadly flaw. Climbing over the side of a boat under fire, silhouetted against the sky, is a good way to get an entire boatload of men killed before they reach the sand. The solution was the ramp, a boat whose entire bow could drop down into a broad, flat ramp, so that men and even vehicles could rush straight out the front, low and fast, directly onto the beach. The idea of a bow ramp was not originally an American invention, and the way it reached Higgins is one of the most remarkable threads in the whole story. The Japanese military, fighting in China through the 1930s, had developed and used landing craft with bow ramps, boats of a type the Japanese called the Daihatsu. In 1937, during the fighting around Shanghai, a young United States Marine officer named Victor Krulak was serving as an observer. Krulak, a sharp and famously determined officer who would rise to become a general and remain a legend in the Marine Corps, watched Japanese forces land from these ramped craft and understood at once that he was seeing something important. He took photographs. He wrote up detailed reports on how the boats worked, how the bow dropped to let men and equipment pour straight out onto the shore. He sent his observations back into the American military system, arguing that this was the future of amphibious assault. And there, at first, they largely sat. The reports drifted into the files of a peacetime bureaucracy that was not yet ready to listen, and years passed before their value was acted upon. When the Marines finally pushed hard for a ramp on the Higgins boat, that earlier intelligence was part of what they were drawing on. The knowledge of what the Japanese had already proven on the far side of the world helped make the case. Higgins, once he embraced the idea, threw himself into making it work on his hull, marrying the ramp concept to a boat that could already do the hard part of beaching and retracting. It is a strange and revealing chain. A Marine watching Japanese boats in a Chinese river in the 1930s helped shape the boat that would carry American soldiers onto French sand years later. The result was an evolution. The early ramped Higgins boats led, step by step, to the craft that would become famous. It was officially designated as the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, known forever after by its initials as the LCVP, though to almost everyone who ever saw one, it was simply the Higgins boat. It married the shallow water, self-beaching, retractable hull that Higgins had perfected in the bayous to the drop-down bow ramp that let a squad of soldiers, or a small vehicle, pour straight out onto the shore. It was, at last, the complete answer to the problem. A boat that could carry troops or a vehicle or cargo, run right up onto any open beach, drop its ramp, disgorge its load in seconds, and then reverse off the sand to go back for more. Let us look at the boat itself, because its very ordinariness is part of the miracle. The Higgins boat was about 36 feet long and a little over 10 feet wide. It was built largely of plywood, with steel used for the ramp and for protection where it mattered most. That plywood construction was not a weakness, but a strategic advantage. Steel was one of the most fought-over materials of the entire war, demanded by shipyards and tank factories and every other corner of the war machine. A boat built mostly of wood sidestepped that bottleneck. It used a material that was more available, and it could be built by workers who did not need to be master steel shipwrights. It could be produced fast, and produced in enormous numbers. The boat carried a crew of 3 or 4. It could take on something like 36 fully equipped soldiers, or a small vehicle such as a jeep, or several thousand pounds of cargo. It could make somewhere around 9 to 12 knots. It mounted machine guns for a measure of covering fire. It was not fast, not comfortable, and not elegant. It pounded brutally in any kind of sea, and the men crammed inside were often violently sick before they ever reached the shore. But it worked. It did the one impossible thing that needed doing. It reliably put a load of men or machines onto a hostile beach where there was no port, no dock, and no welcome, and then it went back for the next load. The famous troop-carrying boat was not the only thing that came out of these plants either. Higgins built the larger tank-carrying landing craft that put armor onto the beaches. He built support and command versions of his boats, and he built fast, dangerous little warships called patrol torpedo boats, the craft the Navy designated with the letters PT. These were small, fast, wooden-hulled boats, armed with torpedoes and machine guns, built to dart in against much larger enemy ships, and then run. In the summer of 1941, the Navy held a series of competitive trials for these boats, an event the crews nicknamed the Plywood Derby. in which different builders raced and tested their designs against one another in open water. Higgins' boats competed hard in that contest against established builders. His company went on to produce a substantial number of patrol torpedo boats that served in the war, adding yet another line of production to plants already straining to build landing craft as fast as humanly possible. The same restless, combative energy that drove the landing craft fight drove all of it. Now multiply that single humble boat by the tens of thousands, and you begin to see the scale of what Higgins built. Once the dam finally broke and the orders started flowing, Higgins Industries expanded at a furious, almost unbelievable pace. What had been a modest boatworks exploded into a sprawling industrial empire spread across several plants in and around New Orleans, at sites scattered along the city's waterways and canals. The workforce swelled from a few hundred people before the war into a small army of workers at its peak, tens of thousands of them, working around the clock in shifts to keep the lines moving. The company produced not only the famous troop boat, but a whole family of vessels, and it did so at a tempo that stunned observers who came to see it for themselves. The total is staggering. Across the war years, Higgins Industries built something on the order of 20,000 boats of various types. The single most produced of all these craft was the troop-carrying landing boat, turned out in the many thousands, the workhorse that would appear on virtually every invasion beach of the war. To build at that scale, Higgins pioneered assembly line methods for boats that most of the industry had thought impossible, treating hulls almost the way an automobile plant treated cars, breaking construction into stages and standardizing parts so that relatively unskilled workers could each master one piece of the job. He was, in his own rough way, doing for boats what the great automobile plants had done for cars, and he was doing it under the pressure of a war that could not wait. There were also far more ambitious gambles that did not pay off. Higgins reached beyond boats entirely, taking on huge government contracts that stretched his company into new and unfamiliar territory. He built an enormous new plant at a site called Michoud, on the eastern edge of New Orleans, tied to a vast wartime production contract, and he pursued a separate scheme to mass-produce large cargo ships using the same assembly line principles that had worked so well for landing craft. These grand ventures ran into serious trouble, and the biggest of them were ultimately cancelled before they could deliver on their promise, leaving behind the memory of an ambition that had outrun what could actually be accomplished. They were a preview of the harder times to come, a reminder that the same boldness that made Higgins great could also lead him to overreach. There is a striking claim often repeated about the scale of this achievement, and it is worth stating carefully so we get it right. It has frequently been said that by a certain point in the war, the overwhelming majority of the vessels in the entire United States Navy, a figure often cited as around 92%, were boats designed by Higgins. That figure, understood properly, refers to the sheer count of naval vessels, and it is driven by the staggering number of small landing craft and similar boats churned out during the war, of which Higgins' designs made up a huge share. It is not a claim about tonnage or firepower, obviously. One battleship outweighs thousands of landing boats, but as a raw count of hulls in the water, the point stands, and it is astonishing. The navy that fought the Second World War was, in terms of the number of individual craft, very largely a Higgins navy. And here is a part of the Higgins story that deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because it says something remarkable about the man and about what was possible even in a deeply unjust time. Higgins Industries, operating in the segregated American South of the 1940s, ran a workforce that was, by the standards of its time and place, extraordinary. Higgins hired black workers and white workers, women and men, the young and the old, and people with disabilities, and he put them to work alongside one another on the same lines. And, remarkably for that era and that region, his company was known for paying the same wage for the same job, regardless of race or sex. We should be precise and not romanticize this into something it was not. The plants were not some perfect model of harmony, and the wider society around them remained rigidly segregated and profoundly unequal. Even inside the plants, the day-to-day reality still bore the marks of that segregated world, and it would be wrong to imagine some fully colorblind workplace, decades ahead of its time. Higgins was a businessman, driven above all by the need to produce boats as fast as humanly possible, and he hired whoever could do the work because he needed every capable pair of hands he could get. But the practical result was a large industrial workforce, in the Deep South, in the middle of the war, that brought together black and white workers, women and men, the young, the old and the disabled, and that paid the same rate for the same job across those lines. In that time and that place, an equal wage regardless of race or sex was genuinely unusual, and it is a real and verified part of what makes the Higgins story more than just a story about boats. Higgins himself presided over this sprawling operation as a kind of force of nature. He was famous for the way he goaded his workers and the wider public toward greater effort, plastering his plants and the city with slogans urging the workforce on. He fed his people, kept the lines running through the night, and drove production with a mix of bullying, showmanship, and genuine pride in what his workers could do. He also never stopped fighting his enemies in Washington, and he took his war to the newspapers and magazines, buying advertisements that did not sell boats so much as attack the bureaucracy he blamed for slowing the war effort. He was a public brawler in an age of quiet procurement, and he seemed to relish every minute of it. There is a reason the people who worked for him remembered him with a mixture of fear, exasperation, and fierce loyalty. He was impossible, and he got the boats built. The people on those lines were building something whose importance is almost impossible to overstate. So let us leave the factory floor and follow the boats to the places where their work was finally judged, on the beaches, under fire, in the moments the whole design existed to survive. Consider what the Higgins boat actually made possible, strategically, at the very highest level. Because a mass-produced craft existed that could land troops and vehicles across open, undefended beaches, Allied commanders were freed from the terrible necessity of assaulting fortified ports head-on. They could choose their landing sites based on where the enemy was weakest, rather than where the docks happened to be. They could achieve surprise. They could spread out along miles of coastline. The entire Allied strategy of the war, the great chain of amphibious invasions that rolled across North Africa, then Sicily, then the Italian mainland, then the beaches of Normandy, and across countless islands in the Pacific, rested on the assumption that you could put an army ashore where there was no port. That assumption was only safe to make because the boats to do it existed in overwhelming numbers. This is exactly what Eisenhower meant. Remember his words. He said that if Higgins had not built those boats, the whole strategy would have had to change, that the Allies would have been forced to attack the enemy at the fortified ports, where the enemy was strongest. Take away the landing craft, and you take away the freedom to land anywhere. Take away that freedom, and the Allies would have been forced to fight the exact battle the Germans had spent years preparing for. The one part of the coast the enemy had turned into a fortress. And here is the deeper irony, the thing that turns this from a story about a clever boat into a story about two different ways of thinking about the same war. The German defense of Europe was built, in large part, around the conviction that the Allies would need a port. It was a reasonable belief. It was consistent with centuries of military logic. It was the same logic that most navies in the world had followed. The enemy prepared, brilliantly and expensively, for the invasion he expected. He fortified the harbors. He studied the lessons of failed assaults on defended ports, and concluded, correctly, that such assaults were suicidal. The Germans even had what looked like hard proof that they were right. In August of 1942, a large Allied force, mostly Canadian, raided the French port of Dieppe. It was, in part, an attempt to seize a defended harbor directly, and it turned into a catastrophe. The attackers were cut down on the shingle beach, tanks were stranded, and the raid was thrown back with terrible losses. To the German command, Dieppe seemed to confirm the entire foundation of their coastal defense. Assaulting a fortified port head-on was suicide. Therefore, they reasoned, the Allies would either have to try it and be destroyed, or they would have to find some way to seize a port intact, and either way the ports were where the decisive battle would be fought. So the Germans poured concrete and steel into their harbor fortresses, confident that they understood the shape of the coming invasion. What the German command underestimated was that the Allies had drawn a very different conclusion from the same brutal evidence. If you could not take a defended port, then you would not take a defended port. You would land where there was no port at all, across open beaches the enemy had considered too undeveloped to bother defending so heavily, and you would bring your harbour with you or build supply straight across the sand. The Allies had quietly removed the need to capture a port in the first place, not through some secret weapon or grand strategic revelation, but through a plywood boat designed for oil drillers and refined in the swamps of Louisiana, built in tens of thousands by a workforce of women and men of every background under a profane, hard-driving boss who most senior officers had spent years trying to ignore. When the invasion came, it did not come against the fortified harbours the enemy had laboured over. It came across open beaches, delivered by the thousands of ugly little boats the enemy had never truly reckoned with. The Germans had prepared, with great skill, for a kind of war the Allies had simply chosen not to fight. The boats proved themselves across the whole span of the war, in both great oceans. One of their first major tests came in the Pacific in August of 1942, when United States Marines went ashore at Guadalcanal in the opening American offensive of the Pacific War. Higgins boats carried men onto that contested island, and the campaign that followed became one of the brutal turning points of the fighting against Japan. From there, the pattern repeated across island after island, as American forces clawed their way toward Japan, one landing at a time. Each assault depending on small boats that could cross the last stretch of water and put men onto a defended shore. It is worth pausing on one hard lesson from the Pacific, because it is often misremembered, and getting it right actually deepens the story rather than diminishing it. At the assault on the island of Tarawa in late 1943, American forces ran into a disaster in the shallows. Tarawa was ringed by a coral reef, and on the day of the landing, the tide behaved in a way that left far too little water over that reef. The conventional landing boats, which needed a certain depth of water beneath them, grounded on the coral well short of the beach. Men had to climb out and wade hundreds of yards through the lagoon under withering fire, and many never made it. This was not a failure of the Higgins design so much as a brutal demonstration of the limits of any boat that floated. What actually crossed that reef were tracked amphibious vehicles, machines that could crawl over the coral where a boat could not float. The lesson of Tarawa was not that the landing boat was obsolete. It was that some obstacles demanded a vehicle that could keep going where the water ran out, and that planners would have to match the craft to the ground. The Higgins boat remained the essential workhorse for the vast majority of landings where the approaches allowed it, which was most of them. On the great day of the Normandy invasion in June of 1944, and on countless island shores across the Pacific, it was the Higgins boat that carried the first men in. Picture it from inside the boat. Soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder in a wooden hull, the sea slamming against the flat front of the ramp, spray and vomit and prayer, the coxswain fighting to hold his heading in the surf. Then the grind of the hull touching bottom, the shouted order, and the ramp dropping away to reveal a strip of hostile sand and whatever waited on it. For the men who lived, the memory of that dropping ramp would never leave them. For the strategy of the entire war, that dropping ramp was the mechanism that made everything else possible. Every plan on every map ultimately came down to whether a wooden boat could put men on a beach and go back for more. It could. It did. Countless times, across years of fighting, on shores in every theatre of the war. Now we can return to the strange question we started with, and see it clearly. Why would anyone, even in legend, reach for a phrase like the new Noah to describe a boat builder from New Orleans? The image, whatever its true origin, contains a real insight, and that is probably why it has endured even without solid documentation behind it. Noah, in the old story, is the man who builds the vessel that carries life across an impassable flood to safe ground on the other side. That is, in a very literal sense, what Higgins boats did. They carried armies across the water and set them down on the far shore. Whoever first reached for that comparison whether it was really uttered in Berlin or invented later by an admirer, was grasping at the same truth that Eisenhower stated plainly. The boats were not a detail. They were the thing that made the crossing possible. The flood, in this version, was the sea itself and the fortified coast beyond it. And the boats were the answer to a problem that had stopped every conventional approach cold. If you are finding this account valuable, a like helps it reach more viewers, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the parts of this war that rarely make it into the standard histories. There is a hard final chapter to the Higgins story, and honesty requires that we tell it, because it complicates the triumph in ways that are worth understanding. The very qualities that made Andrew Higgins so effective in a crisis, his stubbornness, his refusal to defer to authority, his willingness to fight anyone who stood in his way, did not serve him nearly as well once the crisis passed. His relationship with the government, always stormy, did not soften with victory in sight. The cancelled cargo ship venture had already shown that his boldness could outrun even his own extraordinary capacity to deliver, and the end of the war would expose that vulnerability in full. When the war ended, the enormous demand that had made Higgins Industries into a giant simply evaporated. The contracts that had poured in stopped almost overnight. A company built to produce boats by the thousands for a global war had no comparable peacetime market. Higgins tried to pivot to civilian production, to find new uses for his plants and his workforce, but nothing could replace the sheer scale of the wartime effort. The company that had been one of the most productive boat builders on Earth contracted sharply. Labor troubles and financial strain followed. The empire that had risen so explosively came down a great deal faster than it had gone up. There was a bitter symmetry to it. The same tidal wave of government orders that had raised Higgins Industries from a small boatworks to an industrial empire in just a few years drained away just as fast when the shooting stopped. A company built entirely for the emergency of total war had no natural place in a nation returning to peace. The plants that had roared through the night fell quiet. The tens of thousands of workers who had built the boats that carried armies dispersed. Higgins scrambled for new products and new markets, but nothing in peacetime could absorb the enormous capacity he had built, and the great enterprise shrank back towards something far more ordinary. Andrew Higgins himself did not live long into the peace he had helped to win. He died in the summer of 1952, worn down by years of relentless, punishing work, hard living, and failing health. He was in his middle 60s. He did not die a celebrated national hero honored with parades and monuments. He died as what he had always been, a hard-driving businessman who had burned himself out at a furious pace. For decades after his death, his name faded from the popular memory of the war, remembered mostly by the men who had ridden his boats and by the historians who understood what those boats had done. The general public told the story of the Second World War through its famous commanders and its decisive battles, rarely heard the name of the boat builder without whom those battles could not have been fought the way they were. That neglect has slowly been corrected, and the man most responsible for correcting it is the same historian who preserved Eisenhower's astonishing verdict. Stephen Ambrose, who recorded Eisenhower calling Higgins the man who won the war, became one of the most widely read popular historians of the Second World War in America. Ambrose understood exactly what the boats had meant, and he understood that they had been designed and built in New Orleans. When he helped found a major national museum dedicated to the war, it was placed in that city, and its original heart was the story of the invasion beaches and the boats that made them possible. Over the years, that institution grew into one of the most important museums of the war anywhere in the world. Its very location is, in a real sense, a monument to Andrew Higgins, a recognition that this unglamorous city on the Mississippi River and the difficult man who built boats there sat much closer to the center of the war's outcome than the popular story had ever admitted. So the record has been set straight, slowly, by people who went back to the evidence. The strange, difficult, brilliant figure of Andrew Higgins has gradually been restored to something closer to his true place in the story. Not as a general, not as a statesman, but as the industrial genius whose plywood boats quietly determined the shape of the war. His name now sits, for those who look, alongside the names of the commanders and the campaigns, exactly where a 5-star general once tried to put it. So what is the real lesson buried in all of this? The thing worth carrying away once the beaches are quiet and the boats are gone? It is tempting to make it a simple story about one heroic individual, the lone genius who saw what everyone else missed. But that is not quite right, and it is not quite fair to the truth. The deeper point is about two different theories of how to solve an impossible problem, and about which one matched the real world. One theory said that an army arrives through a port, that the way to invade is to seize the enemy's harbors, and that the whole art of coastal defense is therefore the art of defending those harbors. It was a coherent theory. It had history behind it. The enemy built his defenses around it, and did so with great skill and enormous effort. Within its own terms, that theory was not foolish. It was simply built on an assumption, the assumption that a modern army could not be supplied across an open beach, and that assumption was about to stop being true. The other theory said something quietly radical, that if you had the right boat, and enough of them, you did not need the enemy's ports at all. You could make your own landing place anywhere the water met the land. You could turn every mile of open coast into a potential invasion beach, and in doing so, you could render the enemy's greatest fortifications almost beside the point, not by defeating them, but by going around them. That theory did not come from a war college or a general staff. It came, at bottom, from a boat designed to carry oil drillers and trappers across the shallow water of a Louisiana swamp, and from a man too stubborn to accept that the experts knew better than the evidence in front of them. Both theories were internally logical. Only one of them was matched by a boat that actually existed in the tens of thousands when the decisive moment came. That is the difference between them, and it is the whole difference. The German command was not beaten by a better idea about ports. It was beaten by an army that had quietly opted out of the entire question, that had built the means to land where no port existed, and that therefore never had to fight the battle the enemy had so carefully prepared to win. Andrew Higgins did not set out to change the strategy of a world war. He set out to build a better boat for men working in the mud. He solved a small, practical, local problem so completely that his solution turned out to answer a vast, global, strategic one that had not even been asked yet when he first drew the lines of his hull. The whole story lives in that gap, in the distance between the humble problem he meant to solve and the enormous one he actually did. Maybe that is why the image of the new Noah has clung to his name for so long, true quote or not. Because whether or not any enemy ever spoke the words, the picture points at something real. A man who built the vessels that carried a world across the water to the far shore, and who, in doing so, helped decide the fate of that world from a plant on a hot New Orleans night, cursing at his machines, certain against all the experts that his ugly little boat was going to matter. He was right. It did. If this account gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. It is how stories like this one reach the people who care about getting the history right.